Baby's Stroller. Redesigned for bear passengers. They ride together. Always. The morning mist hung low over the forest floor like a blanket someone had forgotten to fold away, and Jacob Bennett stood at his cabin window watching it swirl between the pine trees that surrounded his home. He had been standing there for nearly an hour, coffee growing cold in his hand, when he saw something that made him set the mug down slowly on the windowsill. There, at the edge of where his small yard met the wilderness, sat a bear cub. Not running, not foraging, just sitting there like it was waiting for something, or someone. The cub couldn't have been more than 6 months old, its fur still carrying that fuzzy quality that young bears have, and it was looking directly at his cabin with eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a small creature. Jacob had lived in these woods for 3 years now, ever since everything in his life had changed. And he had seen plenty of wildlife. Deer walked through his yard like they owned the place. Raccoons raided his garbage cans with the dedication of professional thieves, and yes, he had even seen adult bears from a distance. But never like this. Never a cub alone, never one that just sat there watching his home like it was contemplating whether to knock on the door. He waited for the mother to appear, scanning the tree line nervously because everyone knew you didn't want to be between a mother bear and her cub. But no mother came. The minutes stretched on and the cub remained alone, occasionally tilting its head as if listening to something Jacob couldn't hear. The smart thing would have been to stay inside, to wait for the cub to lose interest and wander back into the forest where it belonged. Jacob knew this. He had read all the pamphlets about living in bear country, had attended the mandatory safety meeting when he first moved here. Don't feed the bears, don't approach the bears, don't do anything that might make the bears associate humans with food or safety. But there was something about the way this particular cub sat there, patient and still, that made all those rules seem less important than the pull he felt to step outside. Maybe it was the loneliness that had wrapped around him like a second skin these past 3 years, or maybe it was just curiosity, but Jacob found himself reaching for the door handle. The screen door creaked as it opened, the sound sharp in the morning quiet, and Jacob expected the cub to bolt. Any sensible wild animal would have, but the cub just watched him step onto the porch, its dark eyes following his movements with an intelligence that made Jacob's skin prickle. Not with fear exactly, but with the strange feeling that he was being evaluated, measured against some standard he didn't understand. He took a step down from the porch, then another, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. The cub didn't move. It was like approaching a statue, except for the gentle rise and fall of its breathing, and the way its nose twitched slightly, probably catching his scent on the morning air. When Jacob was about 10 feet away, he stopped. This was close enough to see the details he had missed from the window. The cub's fur wasn't uniformly brown, but had lighter patches around its ears and paws, giving it an almost painted appearance. There was no visible injury that might explain why it was alone, no limp when it finally stood up. And when it did stand, instead of running away or coming closer, it did something that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. The cub walked in a perfect circle, 3 times, then sat back down in exactly the same spot. It was deliberate, purposeful, like a ritual or a message. Jacob had spent enough time in these woods to know that animals didn't behave this way without reason. He went back inside and watched from the window again, but the cub remained. An hour passed, then 2. Jacob tried to focus on his work, the freelance coding projects that paid his bills and kept him connected to a world beyond these trees, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. The cub was still there at noon, had barely moved except to occasionally stand and perform that same circling ritual. By afternoon, Jacob's concern overrode his caution. He grabbed an apple from his kitchen, knowing he was breaking the cardinal rule of bear country, and walked back outside. This time, the cub stood as he approached but didn't circle. Instead, it took 3 small steps toward him, then stopped, waiting. Jacob rolled the apple across the grass, watching it come to rest about halfway between them. The cub looked at the apple, then back at Jacob, then did something that would have seemed impossible if Jacob hadn't seen it with his own eyes. It pushed the apple back toward him with its nose, gently, carefully, like it was returning something that didn't belong to it. Then it sat down again and resumed its patient watching. Jacob picked up the apple, confused and increasingly certain that this was no ordinary wildlife encounter. The cub wasn't here for food. It was here for something else entirely. As the sun began to sink toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Jacob painfully of other sunsets he had watched with someone no longer here, he made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. He sat down on the grass, crossing his legs like a child at story time, and just existed there with the cub. Neither of them moved much, just sat in a companionable silence that felt strangely familiar. Like meeting an old friend, whose name you couldn't quite remember. When darkness finally forced Jacob back inside, the cub stood, performed its 3 circles one more time, and melted into the forest shadows. But somehow, Jacob knew it would be back. He was right. The next morning, the cub was there again, sitting in the exact same spot like it had never left. This pattern continued for a week. The cub would arrive with the morning mist, sit in its chosen spot, and wait. Jacob would eventually come out, sometimes bringing things to show it, not food, but objects. A book he was reading, a carved wooden bird he had bought at a local craft fair, his laptop, which he would work on while sitting on the grass, the cub watching the screen with what looked like genuine interest. On the 7th day, something changed. When Jacob came outside, the cub stood and walked toward him, not aggressively but with purpose. It stopped just out of arm's reach and made a sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a rumbling purr. Then it turned and walked a few steps toward the forest, stopped, and looked back at Jacob. It wanted him to follow. Every rational part of Jacob's mind screamed that this was dangerous, that following a bear into the forest was exactly the kind of thing that ended up as a cautionary tale in those safety pamphlets. But the irrational part, the part that had brought him to these woods in the first place, seeking something he couldn't name, was already moving his feet forward. The cub led him along a path he hadn't noticed before, though he had walked these woods countless times. It was barely visible, more of a suggestion of a trail than an actual path, winding between trees and over small streams, with a logic that seemed less about efficiency and more about something else. Beauty, maybe, or memory. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, the cub always staying just far enough ahead that Jacob had to keep moving to keep it in sight, but never so far that he felt abandoned. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing Jacob had never seen before, and what he found there made him stop so suddenly he almost tripped over his own feet. In the center of the clearing sat an old baby stroller. Not ancient, but weathered enough to show it had been there for at least a few seasons. It was the expensive kind, with large wheels designed for jogging and a sun canopy that had somehow remained mostly intact despite exposure to the elements. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strange part was that the stroller had been modified. Branches had been woven through the frame in a deliberate pattern, creating what looked like a nest inside where a baby would normally sit. And in that nest were things that didn't belong in the forest. A small mirror, a child's toy, a stuffed rabbit so faded its original color was impossible to determine, a photograph in a plastic sleeve, too water damaged to make out the image. The cub walked to the stroller and climbed into it with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't the first time. It settled into the nest of branches and fabric, looking at Jacob with those impossibly knowing eyes, and made that rumbling purr sound again. Jacob's hands were shaking as he approached the stroller. He recognized the model. It was the same kind he and Lily had looked at in the store 3 years ago, back when they were planning for a future that never came to be. Back when the biggest decision in their lives was whether to get the stroller in navy blue or forest green. They had chosen forest green because Lily said it would hide the dirt better when they took their baby on adventures. The photograph in the plastic sleeve called to him, and with trembling fingers, Jacob picked it up. The water damage wasn't as bad as he had thought. He could make out 2 figures, a man and a woman, standing in front of a cabin. His cabin. But the photo was old, older than his time here. The couple in the picture weren't him and Lily. They were strangers, yet something about the way they stood, the way the woman's hand rested on her belly, told a story Jacob understood in his bones. The cub made another sound, softer this time, and when Jacob looked at it, really looked at it, he saw something in its eyes that shouldn't have been there. Recognition. Not of him, necessarily, but of something. Some pattern or purpose that connected them both to this place, this moment, this impossible situation. Jacob spent the rest of that day in the clearing, examining the stroller and its strange modifications. The branches weren't randomly placed, but woven with a skill that suggested human hands. Though, who could have done this, and why was beyond his understanding. The cub seemed content to stay in its nest, occasionally reaching out a paw to touch different objects like it was conducting some kind of inventory. As the sun began to set, Jacob knew he had to make a decision. He could walk away, pretend he had never seen this, never followed the cub into the forest. Or he could accept whatever strange invitation this seemed to be. He chose acceptance. Using all his strength, Jacob began to push the stroller back toward his cabin. The cub riding along like this was the most natural thing in the world. The wheels, despite their time in the elements, still turned smoothly, and the path that had seemed barely visible on the way in was somehow clearer on the way back. Like it was revealing itself now that he had made his choice. By the time they reached his cabin, full darkness had fallen, and Jacob was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He pushed the stroller onto his porch, and the cub climbed out, performed its 3 circles, and disappeared into the night. But the stroller remained, sitting on his porch like a question waiting to be answered. Jacob barely slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities, each more impossible than the last. When morning came and the cub returned, it went straight to the stroller and climbed in, looking at Jacob expectantly. And that's when Jacob understood. This wasn't just about the cub, or the stroller, or the mysterious photograph. This was about connection, about purpose, about finding a way to carry something forward when everything else had been left behind. He thought about Lily, about the child they never had, about the life he had built in these woods that was really just an elaborate way of standing still. And he made another decision. He would fix the stroller. Not just fix it, but transform it. Make it into something that could properly carry this strange little passenger who had chosen him for reasons he might never understand. Jacob had always been good with his hands, a skill that had served him well in his previous life as an engineer, before coding became his escape. He had tools in his workshop, materials he had accumulated for projects he never started. And now he had a purpose, strange as it might be. The cub watched from its nest as Jacob examined the stroller more carefully, making mental notes of what needed repair, what could be improved, what modifications would make it more suitable for its unusual occupant. The work began that very day. Jacob removed the weathered fabric and cleaned the frame, discovering that beneath the surface, rust, the structure was still sound. The wheels needed new bearings, which meant a trip to town, his first in weeks. At the hardware store, Harold, the owner who knew everyone's business but had learned not to pry into Jacob's, raised an eyebrow at the collection of items Jacob placed on the counter. Bearings, yes, but also soft foam padding, weather-resistant fabric, and an assortment of straps and buckles that seemed to have no common purpose. Harold rang everything up without comment, though Jacob could see the questions forming behind his eyes. Small towns were like that. Curiosity and courtesy in constant tension. Back at the cabin, Jacob worked with a focus he hadn't felt in years. The cub supervised, occasionally sniffing at different materials or batting at tools with a paw, but mostly just watching with those strange, knowing eyes. Jacob reinforced the frame, adding supports that would distribute weight more evenly. He created a custom seat using the foam padding, shaping it to cradle the cub's body comfortably. The weather-resistant fabric became a new canopy, one that could protect against rain but also fold back completely for sunny days. He added pockets along the sides for storing things, though what things he wasn't sure yet. The photograph in its plastic sleeve went into one of these pockets, a talisman of connection to whatever story had preceded his own. As he worked, Jacob found himself talking to the cub. Not the kind of baby talk people usually directed at animals, but real conversation, like talking to a friend who happened to be a very good listener. He told the cub about Lily, about the accident that had taken her and their unborn child, about the numbness that had driven him to these woods seeking something he couldn't name. He talked about his work, the code that flowed through his fingers creating digital worlds while the real world felt increasingly distant. He talked about the loneliness that was different from being alone, the kind that wrapped around you even in a crowd, especially in a crowd. The cub listened to it all, occasionally making that rumbling purr sound that Jacob had come to interpret as understanding, or at least acceptance. The modification process took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of daily visits from the cub, of working together in a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Jacob added features he hadn't planned on, but that seemed right in the moment. A small bell that chimed softly when the stroller moved, creating a musical accompaniment to their future travels. A holder for a water bottle, though the cub had shown no interest in drinking from one. Reflective strips along the sides for safety, though Jacob couldn't imagine taking the stroller anywhere they might encounter traffic. Each addition felt like a small act of faith, a belief that this strange partnership had a future worth preparing for. During those 2 weeks, Jacob noticed changes in himself too. He was sleeping better, eating regular meals instead of forgetting about food until his stomach cramped with hunger. He found himself looking forward to mornings again, eager to see what new understanding might develop between him and his unusual friend. The cub was changing too, growing more comfortable with physical contact. It would now brush against Jacob's leg as it passed, or rest a paw on his knee while he worked. These small gestures of trust felt like gifts, each one loosening a knot in Jacob's chest he hadn't realized was there. The town began to notice changes too. When Jacob went in for supplies, he walked differently, stood straighter. Margaret at the grocery store mentioned that he looked healthier, and Tom at the gas station said something about Jacob seeming more present, though he couldn't quite articulate what he meant. Jacob just smiled and nodded, keeping his secret. How could he explain that a bear cub had given him a reason to wake up in the morning? How could he tell them about the stroller project that had become a bridge between his old life and whatever this new one was becoming? They would think he had lost his mind, and maybe he had. But if this was madness, It was the kind that felt more real than sanity ever had. On the day Jacob finished the modifications, the cub did something new. After climbing into the newly transformed stroller, it reached out and touched Jacob's hand with its paw. The touch was deliberate, gentle, and carried a weight of meaning that made Jacob's eyes burn with tears he hadn't shed in 3 years. Then the cub settled into its custom seat and looked toward the forest path with clear intention. It was time for their first real journey together. Jacob gripped the handlebar, noticing how perfectly it fit his hands now after all the adjustments he had made, and began to push. The stroller moved smoothly, the new bearings silent except for the soft chime of the bell, and they headed into the forest together. The path the cub chose wasn't the one to the clearing where Jacob had first found the stroller. This was a different route, one that wound deeper into the forest than Jacob had ever ventured. But he felt no fear, only curiosity and a strange sense of rightness. The cub sat up in its seat, alert but calm, occasionally pointing with its paw to indicate a turn. They passed through groves of ancient pines, whose trunks were wider than Jacob could wrap his arms around, crossed streams on logs that had fallen so perfectly they might have been placed there on purpose, and climbed gentle slopes that revealed views of valleys Jacob hadn't known existed. After perhaps an hour of walking, they arrived at another clearing, this one larger than the first. In the center stood a single apple tree, impossibly out of place in this coniferous forest. The tree was old. Its trunk gnarled and twisted, but it was heavy with fruit despite the late season. The cub climbed out of the stroller and walked to the tree, standing on its hind legs to reach an apple. But instead of eating it, the cub brought it back to Jacob, placing it carefully at his feet. Then it returned to the tree and did the same thing again and again. 7 apples in total, each one placed with the same deliberate care. Jacob picked up one of the apples, examining it closely. It was perfect, unblemished, the kind of apple that existed more in memory than reality. He bit into it, and the taste exploded across his tongue, sweet and tart and somehow familiar. Like the apples from his grandmother's orchard when he was a child, the ones she said held the taste of summer even in winter. The cub watched him eat, that rumbling purr vibrating through its small body. When Jacob finished the apple, the cub collected the remaining 6 and placed them carefully in one of the stroller's new pockets. Then it climbed back into its seat and waited. The journey back to the cabin felt different. The forest seemed more alive, more present. Jacob noticed things he had missed on the way out, the way certain trees leaned toward each other like old friends sharing secrets, the patterns in the bark that looked like faces if you caught them at the right angle, the sound of the wind through the branches that was almost like whispered words in a language just beyond understanding. The cub dozed in its seat, trusting Jacob to navigate them home, and that trust felt like the most precious thing Jacob had carried in years. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting again, painting everything in gold and shadow. Jacob pushed the stroller onto the porch, and the cub climbed out, but this time it didn't immediately disappear into the forest. Instead, it walked to the cabin door and sat, looking back at Jacob with a question in its eyes. Jacob understood. He opened the door, and for the first time, the cub entered his home. It explored carefully, sniffing at furniture and examining corners, but always staying within sight of Jacob. When it reached the living room, it stopped at a shelf where Jacob kept his few remaining photographs from his life with Lily. The cub stood on its hind legs, studying the pictures with an intensity that made Jacob's heart race. It focused on one in particular, the last photo taken of him and Lily together, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, both of them laughing at something off camera. The cub touched the frame gently with its paw, then looked at Jacob with those impossible eyes. And in that moment, Jacob felt something shift in the room, in the air, in himself, like puzzle pieces clicking into place, though he couldn't see the full picture yet. The cub made a new sound, not the purr or the soft growl, but something almost like a sigh. Then it walked to the corner of the room where Jacob had pushed an old rocking chair, the one Lily had insisted they buy even though it was too early, even though they hadn't even picked out a crib yet. The cub climbed into the chair and curled up, looking so natural there that Jacob had to sit down himself, his legs suddenly unsteady. He watched the cub settle into sleep, its breathing deep and even, and tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just a wild animal that had decided to befriend him. This was something else, something that defied explanation but felt true in a way that logic never could. He thought about the modified stroller in the clearing, the photograph of strangers who weren't strangers, the apple tree that shouldn't exist. He thought about patterns and connections, about losses that echoed through time, about the strange ways the universe sometimes offered comfort. That night, Jacob slept in the living room, not wanting to leave the cub alone on its first night inside. He dozed in fits and starts, waking periodically to check that the small form in the rocking chair was still there, still real. Sometimes the cub was awake too, watching him with those dark eyes that held too much understanding. In those moments, they simply looked at each other across the darkened room, two beings connected by something neither of them could fully grasp but both accepted. When morning came, the cub was still there, and Jacob knew their journey together was just beginning. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that felt both strange and perfectly natural. The cub would arrive each morning. They would take the stroller on increasingly long journeys into the forest, discovering places that seemed to exist outside of normal geography. A grove where the trees grew in a perfect spiral. A pond that reflected not the sky above, but something else, something that might have been memory or possibility. A meadow where wildflowers bloomed out of season, their colors too vivid to be entirely real. Each place felt significant, like pieces of a story being told in a language older than words. Jacob began documenting these journeys, not with photographs that never seemed to capture what was really there, but with sketches and notes. He wrote about the way the cub would sometimes stop and perform its circling ritual at specific spots, always 3 times, always clockwise. He recorded the objects they found in these places, things that shouldn't be there but were. A child's shoe, just one, hanging from a branch 30 feet up. A music box, still working, playing a melody that made the cub purr, and Jacob's chest ache with recognition he couldn't explain. A journal, its pages blank except for a single sentence written in handwriting that looked like his own but couldn't be. They ride together always. The stroller evolved, too, becoming more than just transportation. Jacob added a small speaker system that played soft music, lullabies that Lily had hummed when she thought no one was listening. He attached a canvas shade that could be adjusted to create patterns of light and shadow that seemed to delight the cub. He even added a cup holder for his coffee, because their morning journeys had become his favorite part of the day, and he liked to bring his coffee along. Each modification felt like an act of devotion, though to what or whom, Jacob couldn't say. The town noticed the changes in Jacob, though they didn't know the cause. He was ordering interesting things online, having them delivered to Harold's store. Books about animal behavior, about forest ecology, about local legends he had never shown interest in before. He was seen walking the forest paths more often, though always alone as far as anyone could tell. The stroller remained his secret, hidden on the porch where the angle of the cabin blocked it from the road. Sometimes he wondered what would happen if someone discovered it, discovered the cub, discovered this impossible life he was building. But mostly he didn't think about it, choosing instead to exist in the bubble of mystery and connection that had formed around him. One day, about 2 months after the cub first appeared, something different happened. They were on their usual morning journey when the cub suddenly became agitated, climbing out of the stroller and running ahead on the path. Jacob followed, pushing the empty stroller, his heart racing with worry. He found the cub in a small clearing, standing over another bear cub. This one was injured, its back leg twisted at an angle that made Jacob wince. It was younger than his cub, probably only a few months old, and it was making soft, distressed sounds that tore at Jacob's heart. His cub looked at Jacob, then at the stroller, then back at Jacob. The message was clear. Without hesitation, Jacob gently lifted the injured cub, surprised at how light it was, how it didn't struggle but seemed to understand he was trying to help. He placed it carefully in the stroller next to his cub, who immediately began to groom it, licking its fur with a tenderness that made Jacob's eyes water. They made their way back to the cabin slowly, Jacob's mind racing with practical concerns. He couldn't take an injured bear cub to a vet without raising questions he couldn't answer. But he also couldn't leave it to suffer. As it turned out, he didn't need to make that choice. When they reached the cabin, his cub led him to the apple tree's fruit they had collected weeks ago. The apples hadn't rotted as they should have. They looked as fresh as the day they were picked. His cub took one in its mouth and bit it gently, letting the juice drip onto the injured cub's leg. Jacob watched in amazement as the younger cub's breathing eased, its distressed sounds quieting. It wasn't miraculous healing, nothing so dramatic. But over the next few days, with regular application of the apple juice and the constant care of Jacob's cub, the injured leg improved. Not perfect, it would always have a slight limp, but functional. Healed enough. The second cub stayed. Jacob modified the stroller again, making room for 2 passengers. The cubs would ride together, his original friend and this new addition, looking out at the forest as Jacob pushed them along increasingly familiar paths. The town might have noticed that Jacob was ordering twice as much of certain supplies, but if they did, they kept their observations to themselves. Small towns could be good at keeping secrets when the secret seemed harmless, when the person involved had earned their quiet protection through years of being a good, if solitary, neighbor. The 2 cubs were different in personality. While the first remained contemplative and mysterious, the younger one was playful, curious about everything. It would bat at leaves that hung over the path, try to catch butterflies from its seat in the stroller, and make happy chirping sounds when they passed certain landmarks. But it also seemed to understand the seriousness of their journeys, growing quiet and attentive when they reached the special places, the ones where reality felt thin and possibilities felt endless. Together, the 3 of them formed an unlikely family, bound by something stronger than blood or species or logic. Jacob found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The constant grief that had been his companion for 3 years didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. A quiet sadness that could coexist with joy. The cubs taught him that. They carried their own losses, whatever had separated them from their mothers, their proper lives in the wild. But they also carried a capacity for present-moment existence that Jacob tried to learn from. They found joy in small things. The way sunlight filtered through leaves, the sound of water over stones, the comfort of riding together in their modified stroller, safe and connected. One evening, as fall deepened toward winter, Jacob sat on his porch with both cubs. They had spent the day winterizing the stroller, adding a warm lining and a weather shield for the coming cold. The cubs were drowsy, full from a dinner of fish Jacob had caught in a stream they'd discovered on one of their journeys. As he watched them settle for sleep, the older cub in the rocking chair it had claimed as its own, the younger one curled in a bed Jacob had made near the fireplace. He thought about the photograph from the original Stroller. The couple who had stood where his cabin now stood, who had perhaps experienced their own loss, their own strange connection to these woods and its creatures. He wondered if they had found what he was finding. Not answers, because there were no answers to losses like these, but a way forward that honored both the grief and the possibility of something after grief. A way of living that included mystery and accepted that some things couldn't be explained, only experienced. The cubs had given him that. They had appeared when he was ready to disappear, and they had shown him that life could be strange and beautiful, and worth living even when it made no sense. Especially when it made no sense. Winter came early that year, blanketing the forest in snow that muffled sound and transformed the familiar paths into something new. The stroller's wheels were replaced with runners Jacob fashioned in his workshop, turning it into a kind of sled. The cubs loved this, the smooth gliding motion through the snow, the way their breath made clouds in the cold air. They explored the winter forest together, finding that their special places were even more magical under snow. The spiral grove looked like a cathedral of ice. The pond, that reflected something other than sky, now showed scenes that might have been memories of summer or promises of spring. Jacob's life had structure now, purpose, morning journeys with the cubs, afternoons working on his coding projects, the cubs napping nearby, evenings maintaining and improving the stroller, preparing for the next day's adventure. He still lived alone by any conventional definition, but he no longer felt lonely. The cubs were companions in the truest sense. Their presence a constant reminder that connection didn't require words or even shared species. It required only openness, acceptance, and the courage to follow when something impossible beckoned you into the forest. As winter deepened, Jacob noticed the older cub spending more time at the window, looking out at something only it could see. Its circling rituals became more frequent, more elaborate. Sometimes it would arrange objects in patterns on the floor, pine cones, stones from their journeys, the apples that never seemed to rot. The patterns meant something. Jacob was sure of it. But like so much else about the cubs, the meaning remained, just beyond his grasp. He documented everything, filling journals with observations and sketches, not because he thought he would ever understand, but because the act of recording felt important. Like he was a witness to something that needed witnessing. One night, during a particularly severe snowstorm, Jacob woke to find both cubs sitting by the door, alert and focused. They weren't distressed, but there was an intensity to their attention that made Jacob get up and join them. Through the window, he could see nothing but swirling snow. But the cubs saw something, or sensed something. They remained there all night, Jacob dozing fitfully in a chair he'd pulled over, waking periodically to find them still watching, still waiting. When morning came and the storm had passed, they seemed satisfied, returning to their usual routines as if nothing had happened. But Jacob noticed new tracks in the snow outside, larger than any his cubs could make. Something had visited in the night, had perhaps been welcomed or warned off by the cubs' vigil. The incident reminded Jacob that his cubs were still wild creatures, still connected to a world he could only partially access. They chose to be with him, but that choice was renewed each day, not guaranteed. This made their presence more precious, not less. Every morning, when they climbed into the stroller for their journey, it was a gift. Every evening, when they settled into sleep in his cabin, it was a trust he tried to deserve. He thought sometimes about what would happen when they grew too large for the stroller, when their wild nature called them back to the forest permanently. But mostly, he tried to follow their example, living in the present, accepting each day as complete in itself. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, winter holding on with late storms and frozen mornings. But eventually, the snow melted, revealing the forest floor covered in the green shoots of new growth. The cubs, both larger now but still fitting in their modified stroller if they arranged themselves carefully, seemed energized by the change of season. Their journeys became longer, more adventurous. They discovered a waterfall hidden behind a wall of vines, the sound masked by some trick of acoustics until you were almost upon it. They found a tree that had been struck by lightning. Its trunk opened to reveal a hollow filled with crystals that caught the light like frozen stars. It was on one of these spring journeys that they encountered the impossible. They had taken a path they'd never followed before, the older cub insisting on this direction with unusual urgency. The path led upward, climbing the mountain that backed Jacob's property. The stroller was difficult to push on the steep grade, but Jacob persevered, trusting the cub's instincts. After 2 hours of climbing, they emerged onto a plateau Jacob hadn't known existed. And there, in the center of the flat expanse, was another cabin. Not abandoned, not ruined. Smoke rose from the chimney and laundry hung on a line, moving gently in the breeze. But that wasn't the impossible part. The impossible part was that the cabin was identical to Jacob's. Not similar, identical. Every board, every window, every detail perfectly matched. And on the porch of this impossible cabin sat another stroller, modified in exactly the way Jacob had modified his. The cubs climbed out of their stroller and walked toward the cabin with the confidence of creatures returning home. Jacob followed, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. As they approached, the door opened and a woman stepped out. She was perhaps 60, her hair gray but her movements vigorous. She looked at Jacob with no surprise, as if she had been expecting him. She introduced herself as Sarah, and she didn't seem to find it strange when the cubs ran to her, climbing into her lap as she sat on the porch steps. She told Jacob she had been waiting for him, or someone like him. She had her own story, her own loss from decades ago, her own cubs that had found her when she needed them most. She showed him photographs, faded with age, of herself younger, pushing a stroller with 2 bear cubs along paths Jacob recognized. She talked about the cycles, the patterns, the way the forest offered comfort to those who needed it most, but only if they were ready to accept the impossible. Sarah explained that she had lived on this plateau for 40 years. That time moved differently here, that the cabin existed in a space between what was real and what was needed. She said Jacob's cubs had been hers once, or versions of them, or perhaps all the cubs were the same cubs, cycling through time and space to find the people who needed them. It didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, but Jacob found himself believing her. The evidence was there in the matching cabins, the identical strollers, the cubs that seemed perfectly at home in both places. They spent the day together, Sarah and Jacob and the cubs, sharing stories and comparing experiences. Sarah showed him her journals, decades of observations that matched his own in uncanny ways. The same special places in the forest, though she called them by different names. The same apples that never rotted, though her tree was in a different location. The same photograph of strangers who weren't strangers, though in her version, the couple was different, from an even earlier time. She talked about the responsibility of being chosen by the cubs, of maintaining the cycle, of preparing for the day when someone else would need what they had been given. As the sun began to set, Sarah told Jacob it was time to go. The plateau couldn't be reached by intention, only by invitation, and the invitation was ending. But she said they would meet again, in dreams, if not in waking, in the places where the forest thinned and possibilities multiplied. The cubs climbed back into Jacob's stroller, seemingly unsurprised by any of this. As Jacob pushed them back down the mountain, he looked back once to see Sarah watching from her porch. When he looked back again, the cabin was gone, the plateau showing only trees and stones, as if nothing had ever been there. The journey down felt longer than the journey up, as if the mountain was reluctant to let them go. By the time they reached familiar paths, it was full dark, the moon providing just enough light to navigate. The cubs were quiet, perhaps tired from the day's adventure, perhaps processing their own understanding of what had happened. Jacob's mind was racing, trying to fit this new impossibility into his already impossible life. But underneath the confusion was a strange peace. He wasn't alone in this experience. Others had walked this path, had been chosen by the forest and its creatures, had found a way to live with mystery and loss and unexpected grace. Back at his cabin, Jacob sat on the porch with the cubs, looking out at the dark forest that suddenly seemed larger, more complex, more alive with possibility than ever before. He thought about Sarah, about the couple in the photograph, about all the others who might have been part of this pattern across time. He thought about Lily and their unborn child, about the future they had planned that had been replaced by this strange, beautiful present. The older cub climbed into his lap, something it rarely did, and placed its paw over his heart. The younger one curled against his side, its breathing deep and trusting. Jacob understood then that he had been given something precious and temporary. The cubs would grow, would eventually return to the wild, but they would also remain in some form for the next person who needed them. The stroller would weather an age, would someday be found by someone else who would see in it possibility rather than abandonment. The cycle would continue, had always continued, would always continue. He was just one link in a chain of connection that stretched backward and forward through time, each person adding their own modifications, their own story, their own love to the pattern. He began to write that night, not in his journal, but in a letter to whoever would come next. He wrote about the cubs' preferences, their rituals, their favorite paths. He wrote about the apple tree and its impossible fruit, about the special places in the forest and what to look for there. He wrote about Sarah and the plateau that existed sometimes, about the photograph and what it might mean. He sealed the letter in plastic, like the original photograph had been, and placed it in one of the stroller's pockets. Someday, someone would find it, and either think him mad or recognize the truth that can only be seen by those who need to see it. The summer that followed was golden, each day a gift of warmth and light and adventure. The cubs grew larger, their bodies beginning to show the power they would have as adults, but they still fit in the stroller if they wanted to, and they still wanted to, especially on the longest journeys to the farthest places. Jacob documented everything, his journals growing thick with observations and sketches and pressed flowers from their travels. He sent some of his writings to magazines that published nature essays, carefully edited to remove the impossible parts, keeping the cubs as mere observations rather than companions. The essays were well received, praised for their poetic observation and deep connection to the natural world. If only they knew, Jacob thought, how literal that connection was. In town, Jacob became known as someone who had found peace in the woods, a transformation that the locals attributed to time and nature's healing power. They weren't wrong exactly. They just didn't know the full story. Harold at the hardware store would save interesting items for him, things that might work for projects, never asking what those projects were. Margaret at the grocery store would mention when she got especially good fish in, knowing Jacob bought more than a single man could eat. though she never questioned it. The town wrapped around him like a protective barrier, keeping his secrets without knowing what they were keeping. As fall approached again, marking a full year since the cubs had entered his life, changes began. The older cubs spent more time in the forest alone, though it always returned for their morning journeys. The younger one grew more independent, learning to fish in the streams they visited, climbing trees with increasing confidence. Jacob knew what was coming, had always known, but the knowledge didn't make it easier. He continued their routines, pushing the stroller on paths now so familiar he could navigate them with his eyes closed, but he also began preparing for after. He reinforced the stroller one final time, making sure it would last through weather and years of abandonment before the next person found it. He organized his journals, creating a record that someone could follow if they needed to understand. He spent extra time with the cubs, memorizing the feeling of their fur, the sound of their breathing, the weight of them in the stroller he had pushed for so many miles. He took mental photographs of every moment, storing them against the loneliness he knew would return, though it would be a different loneliness than before. A loneliness with purpose, with memory, with the knowledge that he had been part of something larger than himself. The last journey came on a morning when the mist hung heavy and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The cubs climbed into the stroller without their usual enthusiasm, and Jacob knew they knew. He pushed them along their favorite path, stopping at all the special places one last time. The spiral grove, where they sat in silence for an hour. The reflecting pond, which showed scenes Jacob finally recognized as memories, his and theirs, and perhaps everyone's who had been part of this story. The apple tree, where each of them ate one perfect fruit, the taste bittersweet with ending and beginning. At the clearing where Jacob had first found the stroller, the cubs climbed out for the last time. The older one performed its circling ritual, not 3 times but 7, each circle wider than the last until it encompassed the entire clearing. The younger one touched Jacob's hand with its paw, holding the contact for a long moment before pulling away. Then, together, they walked into the forest. They didn't look back, and Jacob didn't call after them. Some goodbyes were too perfect to spoil with words or wishes for something different. Jacob stood in the clearing for a long time, the empty stroller beside him. Eventually, he pushed it to a spot near where he had first found it, but not exactly the same place. The next person would have their own discovery to make, their own path to follow. He arranged it carefully, placing the letter in the photograph and one perfect apple in the pockets. Then he walked away, back to his cabin, back to his life that would continue but would never be the same. Sinu chapters of Part 1 completed. The weeks after the cubs left were difficult, but not in the way Jacob had expected. He didn't fall back into the numbing grief that had driven him to the forest. Instead, he felt a kind of purposeful waiting, like a guardian of something precious. He continued to walk the forest paths, now without the stroller, and found that the special places remained special even without his companions. The spiral grove still induced a meditative calm. The pond still reflected more than it should. The apple tree, when he found it again, still bore fruit out of season. The forest had accepted him as part of its pattern, with or without the cubs. He began to notice other animals behaving strangely around him. A fox that would walk beside him for miles before disappearing into the underbrush. An owl that seemed to follow him from tree to tree, watching with eyes that reminded him of the older cub's knowing gaze. Even the deer, usually so skittish, would let him pass within feet of them, looking up from their grazing with calm acceptance. It was as if the cubs had marked him somehow, identified him as safe, as part of the forest's inner circle of trust. One day, about a month after the cubs had left, Jacob found tracks in the mud near the stream where they used to fish. Large bear tracks, 2 sets, one slightly smaller than the other with that distinctive limp gait pattern. They were doing well, living their wild lives. He didn't try to follow the tracks, didn't seek them out. Their time together was complete, perfect in its own way. To try to extend it would be to diminish it. But knowing they were out there, healthy and free, filled him with a quiet joy that carried him through the darker moments. He started writing more seriously, working on a book about his time in the forest. Not the true story that would never be believed, but a version that captured the emotional truth, if not the literal facts. He wrote about grief and healing, about the unexpected ways connection could manifest, about the importance of accepting mystery in a world that demanded explanations for everything. His editor in the city was enthusiastic, said the book had a quality she couldn't quite define, something that made her believe in possibilities she had stopped considering years ago. Winter came again, and with it a peace Jacob hadn't felt in years. He maintained the cabin, worked on his writing, took his walks in the snow-covered forest. Sometimes he would pass by the clearing where he had left the stroller, though he never entered it. Once, he saw fresh footprints leading to the clearing. Human footprints, but he didn't investigate. If someone new had been chosen, they deserved their own discovery, their own journey without interference. The pattern would continue as it always had, as it always would. On the anniversary of Lily's death, Jacob climbed to the highest point he could reach, a rocky outcrop that gave a view of the entire valley. He had brought the last apple from the tree, the one he had been saving, though he wasn't sure why. Standing there, looking out at the forest that had given him so much, he spoke to Lily for the first time since the accident. He told her about the cubs, about the stroller, about the impossible journey he had been on. He told her about the healing that wasn't about forgetting, but about carrying love forward in new forms. Then he ate the apple, its taste carrying all the sweetness and sorrow of a love that transcends loss. As he climbed down from the outcrop, Jacob felt something shift inside him. Not an ending, but a transformation. The acute phase of his journey with the cubs was over, but he understood now that he was part of something continuing. He was a keeper of stories, a witness to wonders, a link in a chain of healing that stretched through time. His role now was to live fully, to honor what he had been given by being present for whatever came next. The cubs had taught him that. Life was not about understanding everything, but about being open to everything, even the impossible. Especially the impossible. Spring came with a burst of wildflowers that carpeted the forest floor in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. Jacob found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Not planning exactly, but allowing for possibilities. He started accepting invitations from town, joining the occasional community dinner, helping with the spring festival preparations. People noticed the change in him, the way he seemed more present, more engaged. Some attributed it to his writing success, his book having found a surprising audience among those dealing with loss. Others just said the forest had been good for him. Both were true in their own ways. He received a letter from Sarah, though how she had sent it or how it had found him, he couldn't explain. It was brief, just a few lines saying she was well, that her cubs had returned to her for a brief visit, that the pattern was strong this year. She included a photograph of her cabin, and in the background, barely visible, was another stroller on her porch. Someone else had joined their strange fraternity. Jacob put the letter with his journals. Another piece of evidence for something that didn't need proving, just accepting. One morning, in late spring, Jacob woke to find something on his porch. Not the cubs, not another stroller, but a single bear cub, different from his two. This one was female, he could tell. With a reddish tint to her fur, and eyes that held a different kind of intelligence. She wasn't injured, wasn't lost. She sat by his door with the patient waiting he recognized, but when he opened the door, she didn't enter. Instead, she walked to the edge of the porch and looked back at him, an invitation clear in her posture. Jacob followed her, curious but not concerned. She led him on a path he knew well, to the clearing where months ago he had left the stroller. It was gone, as he had expected, but in its place was something else. A young woman, perhaps 30, sitting on the ground crying. She looked up when Jacob entered the clearing, her face a mixture of grief and wonder and confusion. In her lap was the photograph from the stroller, and Jacob could see even from a distance that she recognized something in it, some connection to her own story. The bear cub walked to the woman and climbed into her lap alongside the photograph. And the woman's tears changed from grief to something else, something Jacob recognized. The beginning of healing, the first moment of impossible hope. Jacob sat down across from her, far enough away not to intrude, but close enough to be present. He didn't speak first, letting her find her words if she needed them. The cub settled against her, patient and calm, and slowly the woman's breathing steadied. She told him her name was Avery, that she had come to the forest to scatter her daughter's ashes, her daughter who had died at 3 months old. She had gotten lost, had wandered for hours, had found the clearing and the stroller and thought she was hallucinating. The photograph in the stroller had looked exactly like one she had of her grandparents, though that was impossible. The apple in the pocket had seemed to glow in the morning light, and when she bit into it, it tasted like the applesauce she used to make for her daughter, the only food that would calm her when she was fussy. Jacob listened to her story, then told her his own. Not all of it, not at first, but enough to let her know she wasn't going crazy. He told her about finding the stroller, about the cubs that had chosen him, about the journey that didn't make sense but didn't need to. He told her about Sarah, about the pattern, about the way the forest offered healing to those who needed it most. Avery listened with the desperate attention of someone who wanted to believe but couldn't quite let themselves. Then the cub in her lap stood up, performed 3 perfect circles, and settled back down. Avery laughed, surprised and delighted, and Jacob knew she was beginning to understand. He helped her modify the stroller over the next few weeks, showing her what he had learned, sharing his tools and materials. Her cub was different from his, more vocal, more openly affectionate, needing different modifications to the stroller. Avery added speakers that played her daughter's favorite lullabies, painted the frame in soft pastels that caught the light, created a canopy that looked like a sky full of stars. As she worked, she talked about her daughter, about her short life and sudden death, about the devastation that had led her to the forest. The cub listened to it all, occasionally touching her face with a gentle paw when the tears came. Jacob became her guide to the special places, showing her the paths his cubs had shown him. But Avery's cub also knew places Jacob had never been. A grove where the trees grew in the shape of a heart. A spring that bubbled up from rocks arranged in a pattern that looked deliberate. A meadow where butterflies gathered in impossible numbers, their wings creating a living kaleidoscope. Each place seemed tailored to Avery's particular grief, her particular need for beauty and wonder and proof that life continued even after devastating loss. They became friends, bonded by their shared impossible experience. Jacob would join Avery and her cub on their morning walks sometimes, and she would come to his cabin for dinner, the cub playing with the toys Jacob had saved from his time with his own cubs. They didn't talk about the strangeness of it all very often. Instead, they talked about normal things. books, movies, the gossip from town. The cubs were simply part of their lives, integrated into their daily existence in a way that felt completely natural, even as they both knew it was completely impossible. Summer deepened, and Avery grew stronger. The hollow look left her eyes, replaced by something Jacob recognized from his own mirror. Not happiness exactly, but engagement, presence. The ability to feel joy alongside grief without one canceling out the other. Her cub grew too, becoming more adventurous, leading them on longer journeys into parts of the forest that seemed to exist in their own pocket of reality. Sometimes Jacob thought he could feel the forest itself responding to their presence, paths appearing where there had been none, clearings opening just when they needed rest. One day, Avery's cub led them to the plateau where Sarah lived, the impossible cabin appearing just as Jacob remembered it. Sarah was there, older now but still vigorous, and she welcomed them like family. She had her own new cub, or perhaps an old cub returned, it was hard to tell. The three of them sat on her porch, three people connected by loss and wonder, watching their cubs play together in the afternoon sun. Sarah talked about the responsibility they shared, the duty to witness and protect this strange magic. She said there were others, scattered across the country, maybe the world, all connected by this thread of impossible healing. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took Avery aside and gave her something. Jacob couldn't see what it was, but Avery emerged from the conversation with tears streaming down her face and a smile that transformed her entire being. On the journey down the mountain, Avery showed him what Sarah had given her. It was a photograph, old and faded, of a young girl with Avery's exact eyes standing next to a bear cub. On the back, in handwriting that looked like Avery's but couldn't be, were the words, "She is always with you," just in a different form. The photograph didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, but sense had long ago ceased to be the measure by which they judged their experiences. Avery placed the photograph in her stroller's pocket, next to the one she had found, next to the apple that never rotted. Another piece of evidence for something that didn't need proving, another link in the chain of connection that stretched through time and space and possibility. The cubs seemed satisfied, as if something important had been accomplished, some circuit completed. Fall came with a glory of colors that painted the forest in shades of fire. Avery's cub began spending more time in the forest alone, just as Jacob's had done. They both knew what was coming, but this time Jacob could offer support, could share the knowledge that the ending was also a beginning. He helped Avery prepare, both practically and emotionally, for the day her cub would return to the wild. They reinforced the stroller together, added pockets for the next person's treasures, wrote letters to whoever would come after. The day came sooner than expected. One morning, Avery's cub simply didn't come. She waited on her porch all day, the stroller ready, hope fading as the sun set. Jacob sat with her through that first difficult night, not offering empty comfort, but simply being present. The next morning, they walked together to the clearing where she had first found the stroller. There, in the center, were tracks, her cub's distinctive prints, joined by others. A family group had passed through in the night, and her cub had gone with them. It was as it should be, even as it broke her heart. Avery left the stroller in a different part of the clearing than where she had found it, adding her own contributions to its pockets. The photograph Sarah had given her, a recording of her daughter's laughter, a letter to the next person who would need what the forest could offer. Then she and Jacob walked back to his cabin, where she would stay for a few days while she adjusted to the absence. They didn't talk much, but their shared understanding filled the silence with comfort rather than awkwardness. A week later, Avery decided to stay in the area. She rented a small house in town, close enough to visit the forest regularly, but far enough to start building a life beyond it. She began teaching at the local elementary school, bringing a gentle understanding to children dealing with their own losses and struggles. Jacob would see her sometimes on his walks, and they would stop and talk, comparing notes on the strange things they continued to see in the forest. The fox that followed, the owl that watched, the deer that knew them. Winter settled over the valley like a familiar friend. Jacob continued his routines, his writing, his walks in the forest that had given him so much. Sometimes he would see signs of his cubs, tracks in the snow, marks on trees that seemed deliberate. Once, he found an apple placed carefully on his porch, fresh despite the season, and he knew they remembered him as he remembered them. He ate it slowly, savoring the taste of connection that transcended separation. The book he had written was published to unexpected acclaim. People found in it something they couldn't quite name, a quality of truth that went beyond facts. He received letters from readers sharing their own strange experiences, their own impossible healings. Some might have been imagination or wishful thinking, but others had the ring of truth that Jacob recognized. The pattern was wider than he had imagined, the forest's magic not limited to his valley. Or perhaps there were many forests, many patterns, many ways the universe offered comfort to those who needed it most. Spring came again, and with it new growth, new possibilities. Jacob had learned to live with the mystery, to accept that some things couldn't be explained, only experienced. He maintained his connection to the forest and its creatures, but he also began to reach out more to the human world. He joined the town council, helped organize the summer festival, even started dating Margaret from the grocery store, who had been patient enough to wait for him to be ready. Life continued, richer for having included the impossible. One day, while walking a path he hadn't taken in months, Jacob found himself at the reflecting pond. The surface showed not his reflection but a scene he didn't recognize at first. Then he realized it was the future, or a possible future. He saw himself older, gray-haired, standing in the clearing with a group of people. Avery was there, and Sarah, and others he didn't know yet. They were all watching as someone new, someone young and broken with grief, found a stroller and a bear cub and began their own journey toward healing. The vision faded, but the promise remained. The pattern would continue. That evening, Jacob sat on his porch and wrote in his journal, trying to capture something that kept slipping away like smoke. The cubs had given him more than healing. They had given him purpose, connection to something larger than individual loss or recovery. They had shown him that the world was stranger and more wonderful than most people ever discovered, that magic existed in the spaces between what was possible and what was needed. He was a guardian now of that magic, a keeper of the secret, a link in the chain. As full dark settled over the forest, Jacob heard a sound that made his heart race, the distinctive huffing of bears, close by but not threatening. He looked into the darkness and saw eyes reflecting the porch light. His cubs, grown now to their full size, magnificent and wild. They didn't approach, maintaining the boundary that was necessary now, but they watched him for a long moment, and in that watching was all the love and connection that had carried him through his darkest time. Then they melted back into the forest, and Jacob understood this was goodbye. The real goodbye, the final one. He didn't feel sad exactly. Instead, he felt complete, like a circle had closed exactly as it should. The cubs had come when he needed them, had stayed as long as was right, and had left when it was time. They had taught him about cycles, about the way endings and beginnings were often the same thing seen from different angles. He raised his coffee mug in a silent toast to the darkness where they had disappeared, then went inside to continue writing his story, their story, the story that belonged to everyone who had ever loved and lost and found a way to continue loving. Years passed. Jacob grew older, his hair graying, his steps slower on the forest paths. But his connection to the woods never faded. He became something of a local legend, the man who knew the forest's secrets, though he never spoke of them directly. Sometimes, when someone came to town carrying a particular kind of grief, the locals would suggest they talk to Jacob. He would listen to their stories, and occasionally, if he sensed they were ready, he would mention that the forest had ways of helping those who needed it. Most dismissed it as folklore, but a few listened more carefully, and some of those few found their way to clearings where strollers waited. Avery became his closest friend, the one person who fully understood the strangeness of their shared experience. She had her own encounters over the years, other cubs that came briefly, other people who needed guidance. Together, they maintained the secret, protected the pattern, ensured that the magic continued. They never spoke of it in town, but their friendship was noted, the way they seemed to share an understanding that went beyond words. Some thought they were lovers, but it was both less and more than that. They were fellow travelers on a journey most people never knew existed. One autumn day, many years after his cubs had left, Jacob received a package with no return address. Inside was a journal, handwritten in a script he didn't recognize. It told the story of someone named Jessica Brooks, who had found a stroller and a bear cub in a forest in Maine. Her story was different in its details but identical in its essence: loss, grief, impossible connection, healing. At the end of the journal was a note. "I thought you should know the pattern is strong. We are not alone." Jacob added the journal to his collection, evidence of a network of magic that spanned far beyond his small valley. He began to compile these stories, reaching out carefully to others who had experienced similar things. There was Michael in Oregon, whose cubs had taught him to sing again after his wife's death. Connor in Vermont, whose stroller journeys had helped him process his son's autism diagnosis. Lily in New Mexico, who had found peace with her miscarriages through the patient presence of her ursine companions. Each story was unique, but all shared the common thread of impossible healing, of bear cubs that knew too much, of strollers that connected past and future and present in ways that defied explanation. As Jacob entered his 70s, he began to think about legacy, not in terms of inheritance or monuments, but in terms of ensuring the pattern continued. He worked with Avery to create a kind of guide hidden in plain sight. They published it as a children's book, a fantasy about bears and strollers and magical forests. Most who read it saw only a charming story, but for those who needed to see more, the clues were there. Maps that weren't quite fictional, descriptions that were too specific to be imagination, a quality of truth that resonated with those carrying certain kinds of grief. The book was moderately successful, finding its way into libraries and bookstores across the country. Jacob received fan mail from children who loved the story, but also occasional letters from adults who read between the lines, who asked careful questions about whether the forest was real, whether the bears truly existed. To these letters, Jacob sent carefully worded responses, neither confirming nor denying, but always including a small map of hiking trails in various forests across the country. Some of those correspondents, he knew, would find what they needed to find. One winter evening, as snow fell soft and heavy outside his cabin, Jacob felt a shift in his chest. Not pain, exactly, but a loosening, like something preparing to let go. He wasn't afraid. The cubs had taught him about cycles, about the way endings were just another kind of beginning, He made himself comfortable in his chair by the fire, his journals stacked beside him, the photograph of him and Lily on the mantel. As he dozed, he thought he heard familiar sounds outside. Huffing breath, gentle footfalls, the soft chime of a bell that might have been from a stroller being pushed through snow. He dreamed he was young again, pushing a stroller through a forest that was all forests. Every forest, the eternal forest that existed in the space between loss and hope. The cubs were there, all of them. Every cub that had ever chosen a grieving human, riding together in an endless procession of modified strollers. Lily was there too, pushing her own stroller with the baby they never had. Except here, in this dream that was more than a dream, they did have her. She was beautiful, laughing, reaching out to touch the bears as they passed. When the townspeople found Jacob 3 days later, after he missed his weekly coffee with Harold, he was peaceful in his chair, a slight smile on his face. On his lap was an apple, fresh and perfect despite the season. The funeral was well attended, the entire town and many from beyond coming to honor the man who had brought such quiet wisdom to their community. Avery spoke at the service, carefully choosing words that honored both the man everyone thought they knew and the one only she truly understood. After the service, Avery walked alone to the clearing where it had all begun for Jacob. She wasn't surprised to find a stroller there, newly modified, waiting for the next person who would need it. Inside was a letter in Jacob's handwriting, though when he could have placed it there she couldn't imagine. The letter was simple. The pattern continues. Trust the cubs. Trust the forest. Trust the impossible. They ride together always. She left the letter where it was, knowing someone would need to find it, someone whose grief would lead them here, to this place where healing took impossible forms. As she walked back through the forest, Avery heard sounds that might have been wind or might have been something else. Huffing breath, soft footfalls, the creak of wheels that had carried so much love through these paths. She smiled, knowing Jacob was still here in some way, part of the pattern now, woven into the magic that connected all of them. The cubs, the people, the forest itself, all riding together through time and space and possibility, offering comfort to those who needed it most, proving that love transcended loss in ways that didn't need to be understood, only accepted. The story never really ended. Even now, somewhere, someone is walking through a forest, carrying a grief too heavy to bear alone. They're about to stumble upon a clearing they've never seen before, where an old stroller sits waiting, modified in ways that don't quite make sense. A bear cub is watching from the tree line, patient and knowing, ready to offer an impossible friendship. The pattern continues, has always continued, will always continue. They ride together always, the grieving and the magical, the lost and the found, connected by threads of love that death cannot break, only transform. In libraries and bookstores, Jacob's book sits on shelves, waiting. Most who pick it up see a sweet story about imagination and healing, but occasionally someone recognizes something deeper, something true. They find their way to forests, to clearings, to impossible connections that remake their understanding of what the world can offer. The network grows, quietly, gently, each new person adding their own thread to the tapestry. Sarah, though ancient now, still maintains her impossible cabin on the plateau that exists sometimes. Avery continues to teach, to guide, to protect the secret that isn't really secret, just invisible to those who don't need to see it. And in the forest, in all forests, the magic continues. Bears that know too much, strollers that shouldn't exist, apples that never rot, photographs of people who might be ancestors or descendants or both. The pattern is strong, stronger than logic, stronger than possibility, stronger than death itself. It offers no explanations, only experiences, no answers, only acceptance, no cure for grief, only a way to carry it that transforms it into something else, something that includes joy and wonder and connection to mysteries that make life larger than loss. This is Jacob's legacy and Lily's, and everyone who has ever loved and lost and found a way to continue. The strollers keep rolling through forests around the world, pushed by hands that shake with grief but steady with purpose. The cubs keep choosing their humans, offering comfort that transcends species and sense. The pattern keeps weaving itself through time, backward and forward, creating a network of healing that exists in the spaces between what is real and what is needed. They ride together always, and in that togetherness, in that impossible, beautiful, eternal connection, there is enough. More than enough, there is everything.